Tonight we are gathered here to hear the marvellous Andrew O&apos, and as those of you who have already seen any of Andrew's appearances during the festival will know, we're really in for a treat. Andrew was born in Glasgow and attended St Michael's Academy there before studying at the University of Strathclyde, and in 1991 he joined the staff of the London Review of Books, one of the UK's leading literary publications, and he worked there for 4 years. In 1995 he published his first book, The Missing, a genre-crossing book which explores the lives of people who have gone missing in Britain and the families they have left behind. His debut novel, Our Fathers, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and his second, Personality, won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize for Fiction in 2003. In that same year, Granta named Andrew one of the best young British novelists. His third novel, Be Near Me, published in 2006, won the Los Angeles Times Prize for Fiction in 2008 and was adapted for the stage. He has also published essays, reportage and stories in the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, Granta, The Guardian and The New Yorker. He has edited a collection of Robbie Burns' poetry and presented a 3-part TV program on Burns for the BBC. His 2008 collection of non-fiction, The Atlantic Ocean, Essays on Britain and America, was shortlisted for the 2008 Saltier Book of the Year Award. Andrew is also a Goodwill Ambassador for the UK branch of UNICEF, a member of the Robert Burns Humanitarian Award judging panel, and an honorary lifetime member of the Irvine Burns Club. He is patron of the Scottish Book Club Trust, a board member of the George Orwell Trust, a director of the London Review of Books, and an editor-at-large at Esquire. He has been a visiting fellow in creative writing at Trinity College, Dublin, and in 2008 was made an honorary Doctor of Letters by the University of Strathclyde. In 2010, Andrew was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. His latest book is The Life and Opinions of Math the Dog and of his friends Marilyn Monroe. Tonight, Andrew will speak about the West, having grown up on the west coast of Scotland, looking west to the island his family came from and further west to America, which was exerting a growing influence over his life. Andrew has apparently thought a lot about the West as literature's dream territory and cinema's golden land, a place at the centre of some of the great debates of modern life. And maybe Perth, perched on Australia's west coast, has a role to play in our notions of westernness. His speech tonight is The West, New Dreams from Noongar. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew O&apos.
In the summer of 1976, a thing happened in our house that seriously challenged my notion of international relations. The English came to stay. Ours wasn't the kind of house where people came to stay, I'm afraid. It was a council house 25 miles from Glasgow, full to the brim with noisy boys, unhappy dogs, phantom parents, and football gloves. But my father had met this man on a building site in Coventry, and rashly, or one might say merrily, he asked him and his entire family to come and stay in what he now and then called Bonnie Scotland. The discussions and tears before the visit went on for weeks. My mother immediately christened them the English, and she threatened to go on strike. I remember her saying she hadn't a clue what to feed the English. And where, just tell me that, Jerry, where would the English sleep? Did they go to bed at a normal time, the English? And when they got up in the morning, did the English have cornflakes or porridge? Or did they expect some sort of banquet from Harrods? I'd like to be able to tell you that when the English turned up, all 5 of them tumbling out of a hippie caravanette, that everything immediately went well and peace and understanding broke out in the land of Robert Burns. But it didn't. The English colonized the house exactly as my mother had predicted. The kids jumped on the beds and laughed, just laughed, at the 3-bar fire. The English daddy never stopped talking in his big English accent, and the mother went straight upstairs for a bath and started smoking in the bathroom. I knew the English were different because the children were doing headstands and handstands in the hall up against my mother's wood chip. And the English mammy and daddy were always having what they called naps. We'd never heard of naps before. This whole new universe of naps opened up because of the English. My 3 brothers and I sat silent on a green sofa. My father rather sheepishly examined his copy of the Daily Record. My mother was in the kitchen with smelling salts, and one of the English children sang a rude song that included the word bastard. "Now, are they Protestants?" said my mother. "Aye, they are." "They are," said my father, "and worse." Long after the English had gone south, my family discussed, for years actually, the true horror of the summer invasion. But in my antithetical, note-taking way, I found myself wondering about them. Who are these exotic beasts, the English, who seemed so to defy, in my mind, the meaning of exotica and beastliness when you really got down to it? They were individualists. At any rate, they weren't a family in the same way we were. Maybe I was secretly quite pleased that the English had muddied my mother's anaglypta. Maybe I just reckoned that they were freer than us. But my first experience of the English left me with the beginnings of a theory to be expounded here and there over the course of the next 2 decades. That whereas the Scottish and the Irish were a people, a definite community, innately together and full of songs and speeches about ourselves, the English were something else altogether. A veritable riot of individualism with no real sense of common purpose and no collective volition as a tribe. I was still thinking about the English the following summer when the Queen's Silver Jubilee brought bunting and arguments to our street. Allegiance, I'm afraid, wasn't much of an option round our way, though the Orangemen of the town wouldn't have agreed, and soon another antithesis floated over the airwaves in the shape of an English pop group called the Sex Pistols, whom my brothers loved to absolute death for singing a song that included the words, "God save the Queen, she ain't no human being." My mother reached for the smelling salts over that one too. But we were happy to go through the motions with the ice cream and jelly on Jubilee Day. But everybody I knew thought the Queen was possibly an English joke against the Scots and a sign of our neighbours' conformity. The sound of the Sex Pistols sounded more like it. They sounded like a riot, a political yawp, an altogether different kind of Englishness. Or was the song just a mistake, an aberration? The record was soon banned in any event, and we went back to imagining the English didn't really know how to behave or how to stand up for themselves or their songs. I gather you had your own English invasion over here, so I come to you in sympathy. In Scotland, of course, we were now never out gathering gilgies or harvesting yams. But on Scotland's west coast, as here on your own vast western world, we felt we were out on our own. We felt we were in some sense, as you are, at the bottom of the world. But as I'll tell you now, we were really at the top, always at the top. And the journey between the two is a modern journey, a journey of self-realization. The problem with the English was not that they were bigger than us, but that they were south, and their imperialism was always of the lazy kind. I'd later learn to love it, of course. Everything we trusted was to the west. Ireland and America and John Wayne lived in the west, and that was the end of the story so far as I was concerned. Not that John Wayne wasn't imperial, of course, but at least he wore a nice hat and drew a gun real fast. Many good human efforts tended towards the west, towards the clean breast of new discovery. We wanted away from colonial assumptions and old-style southern familiarity. It just seemed that life was to be found in the West, and the big task was to work out how to embrace your own Westernness. The task was to see at last that discovery was the better part of your nature. We had starlings flying overhead in Glasgow, not the green and red of the Western Rosella. And the meaning of Western Australia was not, as advertised, merely as an outpost of colonial expansion. In my childhood, the journey to Australia was a search for a better life, a climate of change and possibility, and everyone I knew was caught up in it. We watched those films, those advertisements, and sometimes we waved our friends and their families off, never to be seen again, off to this magic, this Australia. Truth is, we Scots, in tune with our legacy of Jekyll and Hyde, were both colonizers and colonized. And it wasn't perhaps our own Perth that would guide us in how to live with this, but yours. George Fletcher Moore, the Irish lawyer who sought his fortune in the Swan River colony in 1840, recorded the words of Hagan, the Aboriginal seer who saw what was happening and named it. You came to our country and disturbed us in our occupations. As we walk in our own country, we are fired upon by the white man. Why should the white man treat us so? I have to tell you, my mother, in her own sweet-tempered way, would have understood the feeling long after the English had gone off with their cigarettes and their baths in the middle of the day. But the notion of the West was complicated for all of us. We knew what it was to feel marginalized, but we, unlike the native people of Western Australia, knew what it was to take the other role, to stamp on other people's ground. Some of my ancestors came in convict ships and ended up panning for gold in the Kalgoorlie goldfields in the 1890s. We were Westerners who sought our advantage, again in the West. And for many of us, the instinct to go in that direction, to go west, survives the ages. I'm sure that as soon as I could walk, I wanted to walk west. I wanted to be there at the going down of the sun and in the morning to see what the world was all about. A writer is born sometimes with a heart already filled with early promises and lost horizons. And I love the idea embedded in the seasons and in the turn of every new day that life could begin again. It would take years for me truly to realize that Westernness was deep in our DNA. We lived in a kind of dream of suburban improvement. But the new housing estates of Scotland's west coast led to country fields and hedges aslant the sea, where the water seemed like a lesson in timelessness. I remember as a boy going there to read T.S. Eliot. We didn't get out much, or when we did, it was to raise our voices in utterances beneath the lyrics of T.S. Eliot. But I do remember his words by the Firth of Clyde. Those words from the four quartets felt like an invocation to the growing imagination. They felt so real. And they felt like the key to a way of being. What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. And every phrase and sentence that is right, where every word is at home, taking its place to support the others, the word neither diffident nor ostentatious, an easy commerce of the old and the new. The common word exact, without vulgarity, the formal word precise, but not pedantic, the complete consort dancing together. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning. Every poem an epitaph. That already sounded very homely to my Scottish ear. In my end is my beginning were the last words spoken by Mary Queen of Scots. And I felt, as I looked out, that history was speaking through the mercy of poetry to a new age, my age. Here we were, in the West. But what was out there? What was beyond? I found one answer in The Dead, that famous story by James Joyce that closes the Irishman's beautiful collection, Dubliners. In that story, the West of Ireland, comes to represent a repository of native essentials, a zone of pure belonging. Greta, the woman in the story, is struck dumb on the stairs when she hears an old song, The Lass of Orem. Her husband, Gabriel Conroy, sees it happening, and he discovers soon enough that she is still haunted by the death of an old lover, a young man called Michael Fury, who died for her sake. The story becomes a great and beautiful beacon of truth about how we exist. And the West is both the past, the ghostly present, and the future in that story, which to me is James Joyce's masterpiece. Listen with me to the Western voices echoing through the story at the story's end. A few light taps upon the pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the Bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. Did you hear that? the time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. As a boy, I imagined that is a journey we all might wish to make. Standing on the coast, I thought of the island my people had come from. I have an Irish name, Hagan. And beyond Ireland, further west, there was America, a place that was coming to absorb my generation and whose culture seemed set to absorb the world. They were each out there, the past and the future, the great hunger and the maddening feast. And it seemed possible that Westernness and its discontents would become a subject of lasting interest for the likes of me. And so it proved. For in that beautiful story of Joyce's, The Dead, there was also politics and the throb of a changing world. When Miss Ivors wants to insult Gabriel, she calls him a West Briton. Ireland wasn't enough for some natives, she seemed to imply, not for those who must see themselves attached to the glory of a bigger nation. This process of westernization has been a problem for many of our cultures, not least Australia's. And Gabriel rightly sees it as an affront to his own homegrown sense of progress. On my own spot of land, my own tiny western amphitheatre of Ayrshire, the sea performed its duty, serving up evidence of Western power in the shape of submarines. I began taking notes on the American submarines that swept up past Scotland's coast. They sailed from Faslane, the American base among the glens, and carried Cold War nuclear threat past our very front windows. From that moment on, I believe my own sense of the West became a commingling of the romantic and the nihilistic. On the one hand, as I said, it was a zone of dreams, of the pioneering hopes that could lead good people into the Western lands. But on the other, as conjured by those black shapes of submarines on my childhood horizon, the West was also a threat to the safety of nations, an arrogance floating past us. We have lived with the West in both senses now, and have come at last in 2011 to a moment when the double dealing of what we call Western governments selling arms to nations who oppress their people is seen clearly for the immoral horror that it is. Those black submarines of my childhood are caught now, perhaps, in the floating nets of global freedom fighting, the social networks of activism, and the world will never be the same again after this year. It was not American and Allied invasions of foreign lands or centuries of westernization that brought people in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya to see the way out of oppressive darkness, but a generation of the intelligent young who, in company with their mobile phones, set out to question and upend the old order of military and economic patronage networks. Those corrupt governments were often in our lives boosted by the West to the advantage of tyrants everywhere and to the enslavement of ordinary people. The West, as we knew it, can never be the same. And on certain days, it is necessary to admit the possibility that it was the West that gave the West a bad name. Those rolling covered wagons that once carried the prisoners westward. At one time, those tracks were said to be visible from the air. They had carried also pioneers, dreamers to lands of milk and honey. That was the frontier spirit, and we all followed it in one way or another. Many of you here, I'm sure, come from people who followed that route directly. But I would argue that the pioneering spirit, the deep work of the individual imagination and of our communities, has always known something that even government geographers forget. Human imagination and idealism is a movable feast. The journey west also leads to the east, and our search for betterness for our children, for our nations, is not a journey from A to B, but from A to a better A. And in my childhood, that A stood for Australia. Here's a theory. The West can only see its true glories when it finds its way fairly through the East. That is human nature, but it is also modern history, as we've witnessed. The West, as a privileged zone, has had its day, and the future might take its example from places like Perth, where the West stands proud at the frontier of an Eastern promise. There is no nation but the imagination. And in that place, Perth, Australia, may come one day to seem like a kind of lesson. The journey down and away might lead you to a point where Westernness changes its meaning. With a bit of luck and more hard work, Perth, Australia might stand for some of life's great alternatives, a place not of moral finagling, but of civil dignity, a place not of religious piety and racial intolerance and economic bullying, but of a new kind of West, a place where Westernness has long been lived with and thought about and recovered from. The West here might say, like the best of literature, nothing is simply one thing. We are all plural. We are nothing more, each of us, than our power to imagine each other's reality. Perth is not a backwater in that sense, but a frontier. And it must shout that fact from the very rooftops of modern Australian life. A national government that kowtows to old-style American interests is not a national government doing well. It is, rather, a government not looking for the meaning of its own more modern kind of Westernness. Turn off your delinquent American TV channels and go out and look at your own culture, for it tells far more beautiful stories. We live or die. Our culture fades or survives owing to our ability to imagine life afresh and see our territories new. If France today behaved internationally like it did in the 19th century, then it would be a byword for tyranny. If England today expressed its interests as it did in the 1760s or the 1840s, America would still be struggling to deal with the notion of allegiance to foreign power that it now only understands as being something that other nations should feel towards them. America, I'm afraid, and a new notion of the West was founded on the principles of freedom and self-governance enshrined not only in the Constitution, but in the literature of that country and the literature of mine, giving it a language that made the Constitution breathe. Literature, ladies and gentlemen, is like that. It helps us live our lives and helps nations to know themselves. Nationhood is not a badge or a threat. It is a benediction. And we must be free to define it how we like. We may apologize for the past, but we should not do so only to cancel righteous anger. We should do so in order to admit that anger into our moral understanding of how to do better today, not only for ourselves, but for the people we are apologizing to. Apologies are easy. Living with the consequences of regret is a much more creative task. Travelling on the outskirts of Perth in 1922, D.H. Lawrence wrote a letter home where he spoke of, quote, the primeval ghosts in the bush. That ghost, that sense of the past warily haunting the present, may finally, conceivably, be coming to rest. However intentional, however accidental, some cities arrive at a point of clarity about themselves in terms of what the nation is. It's possible that Perth might come to be like that. Its westernness might give it a bead on the world and a consciousness of Australia that is good for progress. From the Indian Ocean to the Darling Range, and dotted like fireflies along the Swan River, or the old sites of Boorloo, the people of Perth, at their best, can send out a notion, to me, a notion at one with the spirit of literary pioneering, that positions human beings and their loved ones and their higher instincts at the helm of change, embracing the modern world as if Western dignity depended on it. 6 years before I was born, Perth became known as the City of Light. Everyone turning on their lights as John Glenn passed overhead whilst orbiting the Earth on the vessel Friendship 7. Let Perth be a living example of the post-colonial spirit making contact with its own past, ghostly present and future, as described in James Joyce's Ireland. Perth is closer to Jakarta than it is to Sydney. It used to be called the most isolated city on earth, which might explain a number of things. It may explain why the city should seize its moment to become a kind of international byword for independence of mind. To me, as a writer, the condition of bliss that writers must learn from their greatest cities is to be industriously apart and socially valiant, keeping all the while to your own style. That should be Perth. And its example of westernness, a new way of being West, can indeed be heard in Jakarta, if not so much yet in Sydney. In my childhood, there was a rabbit-proof fence around the world, from Berlin to China to Iran to Alabama. And bizarrely, to some, it was not only struggle, but the ferment of ideas that brought it down. Perth can take its place, and the job never ends of pioneering a new Western habit of taking down fences. The acts of the imagination are themselves the best offense to tyranny. Talk to the dissidents of Tahrir Square in Cairo, as I have recently, and what you discover is modern individuals busily cancelling the assumptions of their political trackers. They are saying no to old concepts of dictatorship, but also to old concepts of Western paternalism, the dictatorship of benign interventions, security, and economic advisors. The events of this year mean that wherever we come from whatever former site of oppression or fear, we will not go back to Moor River. And Perth knows, in its cultural bones, I hope, what it means to build a society that knows when the rights of a stolen generation will have their day. We sometimes think we are far from the great world. That was one of the cliches of my own youth. But the Black Submarines showed me we were closer than we knew. And it was the job of literature, I don't mind saying here, a literary festival, the job of literature to connect us to worlds both greater and smaller. Here, we stand not only on the West, but our vantage point of Westernness, and at a moment of decision has come for Australia. This is an era when Australia might fulfill its imaginative capacities and engage imaginatively with what it means to be central in the world. For as sure as Western values have freed the world, they have also enslaved it. And as an energy exemplar to the world, Australia might rebuke the Western addiction to oil. The American commentator Thomas Friedman has called for a worldwide gasoline tax, and Australia should pioneer it. To remake the West is most fit to do so, is best placed to come from here. For the last 50 years, Friedman writes, America and Europe and Asia have treated the Middle East as if it were just a collection of big gas stations. Our message to the region has been consistent. Guys, here's the deal. Keep your pumps open, your price is low on oil, don't bother the Israelis too much, and as far as we're concerned, you can do whatever you like behind our backs. You can deprive your people of whatever civil rights you like, you can engage in however much corruption you like, you can preach whatever intolerance you wish to do, you can print whatever conspiracy theories about us in your newspapers that you like, you can keep your women as illiterate as you like, you can create whatever vast welfare state economies without any innovative capacity that you like. You can undereducate your youth if you like. It was that attitude that enabled the Arab world to be insulated from history for the last 50 years, to be ruled for decades by the same kings and dictators. Well, history is back. More than 60 years ago, the English literary critic Cyril Connolly told us it was closing time in the gardens of the West. I remember reading that line when I was researching and writing my latest novel, The Life and Opinions of Martha the Dog. And what I found there was many, many stories of Cyril Connolly's turning up at the house where Martha the Dog was born, asking for wine, better wine. It was Virginia Woolf's sister's house, and he was always complaining about the quality of the wine. He always suspected they had good stuff downstairs that they were keeping back from him. But actually, Cyril Connolly was a great critic and a master essayist. He had a lot to teach us from his pulpit. He was obviously a bit early, though, with his notion of closing time in the gardens of the West. Perhaps, indeed, off the mark altogether. For what we see, if we see our horizons in the round, is what amounts to flowering time in those gardens. The West can make a new role for itself now. It must take new Western principles and principalities, Perth being one, as demonstrated again by the blossoming of ideas resplendent this weekend at the Writers Festival. Should take all that to shake the orthodoxies of self-interest. We must imagine a new relation to the world inside our communities, embedding art and industry at the apex of fairness, and share the world's burdens for the first time, as if we carried not only equal rights over everything, but equal responsibilities too. Literature is the moral sound of human empathy. And it finds its location everywhere. But only we can find it. Only we, alive, can secure it. Only we can maintain it and pass it on. Australia, as much as the United Kingdom, can have a lapdog tendency when it comes to licking the hand of bullying and unquestioning Western power, sometimes ignoring the enlightenments coming from its own dear places. Perth can light up the sky. We've seen it before. And without recourse to timidity or the old provincial notions of dependency, Western Australia may step up and provide a new code of honour for the West in general. A man I once knew organised a tour of America for Dylan Thomas, and he remembers him the last time he saw him, drunk of course, and standing on the steps of a plane out of Nashville. "I'm going further and further west," he said, "further away from Wales, further away from home." But I would argue for another notion of the West, that we go there to find the home of homes, and while we leave it, we come back and we know it again as if for the first time. Among many of the wrong-headed notions that only poetry can bring us to the heart, among many of the wrong-headed notions that kept me growing as a boy, perhaps one was right, the notion that only poetry can bring us to the heart of human power. I certainly thought so as I read the poems of Robert Burns, another Ayrshire writer who taught us so much about how to feel and how to think and how to challenge ourselves with new thoughts, new feelings. At least at the end, even if our imaginative plans fall short, we can sit with a whiskey and be warmed by the fire of our former hopes. I've been trying to talk to you here about how writers can act as a lightning gauge for change across time. And I'd like to pause with you over Robert Burns, because he is, for me, an exemplar of how language and landscape and politics can emerge and go hand in hand with a need for transformation in individuals, but also in whole societies. What Les Murray did for Australia, he also did for the world. What the novelist Tim Winton does for Perth, he does for all of us. And Robert Burns is one of those writers who constantly renews our capacity for life. I first heard the words Robert Burns when I was a skiving wee blether at a primary school outside Glasgow. The headmistress, Mrs. Ferguson, was looking for a young male victim, aged 7, to accompany her on the piano as she rattled out a version of "My Love, She's But a Lassie Yet." "But let her stand a year or twa," I sung, red-faced, mortified, banned forever from the legion of footballing heroes and non-sissies. "But let her stand a year or twa, and she'll no be half sae saucy yet." But I didn't care. I loved the words and the eternity of bare human feeling that lived inside the words. I knew that Burns would never spare my blushes. He didn't that day, and he didn't any day, including all the days of his own life. Burns was a magician of fellowship. He was a magician of compassion, such as we feel when we use his words to oppose wars and inequality. It comes very naturally to him, and maybe it should come more naturally to us to use literature like that, to be better. He was a man of his time, but for all time, showing us how to enlarge ourselves in company with others. Years after the humiliation at Mrs. Ferguson's piano, only the year before last, I was standing in front of the cameras to present the first of these 3 BBC films about Robert Burns. It was a freezing cold day. I mean, that won't surprise you. It was Scotland, after all. Of course, the BBC always want to make everywhere look sunny these days. So if you watch our films, you'd think they were filmed in Barbados. In fact, they were filmed in Kilmarnock. It was a cold day that day, and I was preparing to speak to the camera about Burns and Jean Armour, his wife, outside the Ship Inn down by the harbour side at Irvine. Half the crew were English, of course. The only people who've got jobs there are. So they weren't what we call au fait with the old Burnsian enthusiasm. The girl from the BBC put a blob of something under my eyes to conceal last night's hangover. And I stood looking down the lens, trying to remember Mrs. Ferguson's point that a man who couldn't speak in sentences was probably a criminal. Action, shouted the director. And just at that point, a sonsy-faced, well-oiled, sleeky old man fell out of the door of the ship. Rabbie Burns, is it? He shouted. I'll gie ye Rabbie Burns. You don't know the first thing about the man, you bunch of university wankers. So, that just about summed up the situation. The truth is, there are as many Robert Burnses as there are people to admire him, and I'm happy to embrace them all. But when we're speaking about the immortal memory of Burns, what we're often talking about is the effort to keep his work and his memory alive for new generations, especially those kids like I was, who grew up in households that weren't really made for poetry or immortality, unless you're talking about the kind of immortality that can be achieved on a football field. There were no books in the house. Although I have to tell you that I once said that on Radio 4, and my father phoned me up and said, "You told a lie on the radio." I said, "How come?" "No, I didn't." "Aye, you did. You said there was no books in your house." "There was a book. It was green. It was on top of the fridge for years." I said, "The Kilmarnock telephone directory doesn't count." To me, Burns's great legacy is in the way he linked men up and women, no matter what their class or creed. He's one of history's great unifiers, one of its great Democrats. He's the libertarian's libertarian, let me tell you. And as you know, he was seldom the recipient of equality for himself. Scotland has always wished its great writers, its great men of the West, its great women of the same place, to be men and women of the people, even if those writers were not that way inclined. But few in any language had such a natural instinct as did Burns for inclusion. He wanted the West to be better and the world to be so too. The popularity of Burns may be a testament to our lust for plain speaking. The national poet hated unfairness and the abuse of power. That is his signature, giving intellectual and emotional life to notions of common sense and the common good. Can a single poet summon the essence of a nation? Does Goethe do it for Germany? Pushkin for Russia? Whitman for the United States? Seamus Heaney for Ireland? I once took Heaney up to Alloway to look at the Burns cottage. We were standing outside something called the Tam O'Shanter Experience. You know, that's what it's like nowadays. When the great Nobel Prize winner shook his head and said, what a life had grown up around Burns's talent. Seamus likes a bit of carry on, and I said to him that Ireland would soon show us the Seamus Heaney experience. Aye. And what's going to be in that, he said, bar a confessional box and a couple of old butter churns. We should never forget what literature can do, ladies and gentlemen. I love Robert Burns not for his consistencies or even his convictions, but for the sound of his mind and the song of his humanness. That is what we try to celebrate and what we hopefully have celebrated with you over the last few days. It wasn't a legislator or a party animal who wrote a Marseillaise to the human spirit. A farmer's son from Ayrshire, with an uncanny connection to people's cares and people's wishes for a better life. That Marseillaise is there for honest poverty that hangs his heed and all that. The coward slave, we pass him by. We dare be poor for all that. For all that and all that. Our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea's stamp. The man's the gold for all that. So let us pray that come what may, as come it will for all that pride and sense o'er all the earth shall bear the gree for all that, and all that that's coming yet, for all that man to man the whole world our shall brothers be, for all that. The schools I went to were only 10 miles away from where Burns wrote that poem. And I remember reading him in my bedroom with the rain against the window. With my first typewriter, I sat and typed out the whole of Tam O'Shanter. I told you I didn't get out much. Trying to understand the turns and periods in the poem, the source of the narrative's urgency and comedy and truth. Literature is not a compendium of special effects or a log of political attitudes, but a repository of human vision. And Robert Burns compels readers, all of us, to understand their own capacity for fellowship. It was the American poet Wallace Stevens who said that the reading of poetry helps you to live your life. And in Burns's hands, the reader comes away humanized, better equipped to tolerate our own failings and perhaps to appreciate the glories of the world. Burns was not merely Scotland's gift to the world, but humanity's gift to Scotland. Up in the wards when my daughter was born 7 years ago, and the London traffic seemed to hush the crowds in lieu of this brand new person, I thought of Robert Burns's first love poem as I looked into her face. He wrote it when he was 15 years old. Oh, once I loved a bonny lass, and I love her still. And whilst that virtue warms my breast, I love my handsome Nell. Great poets follow us. Great writers follow us. Long after we followed them, and they linger like spies in the shadows of the mind. Now and then we turn in an empty street and see them light a match. Perhaps we say, "You were my best friend all along. You shadowed me in my life. You made my life bigger." That is not to suggest that poetry is always a source of comfort, or literature is merely something to soothe, but just to say that it is always, if it's any good, a source of presence. Burns was one of those Western voices that have haunted my sense of what is possible for writers and readers. But you hear it again and again, in those writers, for example, who sung their anthems for doomed youth at the Western Front. And another West appears before us to break our hearts with a vision of discovery at the close of Scott Fitzgerald's masterpiece, The Great Gatsby. I've spoken tonight of beginnings and endings, of a West that opens up possibility and another West that closes it down. But it is Fitzgerald's great last paragraphs in Gatsby that somehow literature itself might embrace the hopes we invest in the West. The narrator Nick Carraway, like Gatsby himself, came to New York from the West, and the search for new dreams, the horror of old politics, will lead him back west again in search of goodness. Here's Nick Carraway sprawled out on the sand. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of an old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. As I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in the vast obscurity beyond the city where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And here you are too, at the most westerly point of all. Why shouldn't the West be among your greatest subjects? Here in Perth, perhaps, we see the Western voice distilled and changed, speaking to the New Orient as much as to the old kingdoms across the sea. New republics indeed are rolling on under the night, and it might take a place like this, a place innately happy to live out on its own at the furthest edge of the Western consciousness, to teach us a lesson in how to move the tectonic plates of human understanding into a new formation. History is back, as I said, but it will not be history as we used to know it. If there are revolutions, as we have seen, there will be revolutions married to technology and culture at its most local. There will be uprisings of the flashing cursor and the instant message. Coalitions will spring up across borders and states and countries and worlds. We are living through the era when change will appear not from the barrel of a gun, but from the common wishes channeled from a million box bedrooms. The West is no longer in charge of the world, not for long. The outbacks have found their voice and their moment. There is nowhere too remote to make its mark now on our understanding. We are each a principality, and each an agent of change. That is what we discovered, and literature plays its part in all of that. The West is not out there or out here anymore. It is inside, in our heads, a place in all of us where ideals might become realities. In Land's Edge, Tim Winton wrote, "West coasts tend to be wild coasts, final coasts to be settled, lonelier places for being last." But we may not be last anymore. We may be first. I've spent some time this week at your beautiful Museum of Western Australia. Writers live by symbols and sleeping truths, and that wonderful place is a repository of such things. But at the end of the largest room, next to the displays of Kings Park and the aluminium roofing of the suburbs, next to a colonial house and a display of gold diggers' pans, next to models of megafauna and echidnas, next to digging sticks used by Noongar women, there are 5 TV screens transmitting live webcam pictures from cities around the world. We see Ulaanbaatar, we see Paris in real time. There's Los Angeles and Glasgow and Venice. We see London, Istanbul, Siena. It felt to me, as I watched them again this morning, that they represented a brand new point in your history. All these world cities viewed at last from the ancient land of Muru, this district of Yelagonga, as if to show in one great moment that Westernness has finally come home to itself. Here we are, wherever we are, at the still point of the turning world, today and now, all frontiers seeming to dissolve in a golden hope of plurality, as much in Western Australia, as much here, and as good here as anywhere. Under the city cams of the world, down there is a quotation from Veronica Brady's This I Believe. Nor do we humans exist separate and apart. We are part of this great polyphony of being as it is played out on our small, invulnerable planet suspended in infinite space. My mind was blown by the proximity of those international live webcams in your National Museum to those ancient spears, those lands, those voices. In closing this festival, let us call it, for friendship's sake, a consummation. The end of the Old West may be in sight, and in that ending, we will find a new beginning. This is Noongar land, and this is Perth, and this is the world itself as it reaches for a new definition that protects all of us. All roads in literature lead to the domestic interior. That is what we heard again and again this week, and what we hear in the best of our writing and in the echoes of our own thoughts. The small business of life, our lives, standing for the universe. And it is true of the most global innovations. We take steps to create a better world, if only to invest in the future smiles of our children and let the grace and rhythm of literature cast a spell on them, forever to free them from prejudice and chaos. I came to Perth, I tell you, as if coming to visit an old part of myself, a part that wants Western ideals constantly to outfox our Western depravities. There is a new notion of the West potential for light. Let us, for now, call it a Noongar of the mind, a Perth of the heart, and let it carry the best human ideals across all boundaries into a world where there is no need for a place called the West, the East, the North, and the South. And so we return to T.S. Eliot, to Little Gidding, and the notion of the returnability of life, the endless West once before us and now, day by day, hour by hour, behind us. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown, unremembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning, at the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves of the sea. Thank you.